Hey everybody, today we'll be discussing sentence structure. I'm sure you already know that there are some key things that you need in a proper sentence, such as a capitalized letter at every beginning of a sentence and a punctuation mark at every end of a sentence. But a sentence must also be a complete idea. What is a complete idea? Well, a complete idea usually includes or must include a subject and verb, or a verb can also be called a predicate. A sentence that is a complete idea makes sense on its own and expresses a complete thought. For instance, does the sentence "go shopping" make sense? No, because it doesn't have a subject. You could say "she goes shopping" and that would make sense because it has the subject "she." What about "my sister's cat"? Does that make sense? No, there is no verb in this sentence, so it does not make sense. You could say "my sister's cat walks." Finally, what about "she goes to the"? Does that make sense? No, that does not express a complete thought. She goes to the what? The mall? The bookstore? A subject of the sentence is the thing doing the action or the thing that is something. It is usually found at the beginning of a sentence and it can be a noun or a pronoun. Knowing this, can you tell me which out of these sentences, what is the subject? Number 1, the dog barked. The subject of the sentence is the dog. Number 2, I run every day. The subject of this sentence is I. Number 3, our car broke. The subject of this sentence is our car. And number 4, Paris is beautiful. The subject of this sentence is Paris. The next thing you must have in every sentence is a verb or predicate. And this is a word, phrase, or clause of a sentence that describes what is being done. For instance, in the last 3 questions, we discussed barked from the dog barked was the verb. The second sentence, I run every day, run was the verb. And the third sentence, our car broke was the verb. And in the last sentence that we also discussed, Paris is beautiful, is the verb. It comes from the verb to be. Now, these sentences can also be considered independent clauses. A clause is a group of words in a sentence that includes a subject and a verb. A complete sentence, like the ones above, is made up of at least one clause, an independent clause, or the main clause, and this can make sense alone. There is also something called a dependent or subordinate clause. A dependent clause has a subject and verb, but does not express a complete idea and therefore does not make sense on its own. It needs an independent clause to depend on. Some examples include, although I like spaghetti, my favorite food is chocolate. In this sentence, although I like spaghetti is the dependent clause, but my favorite food is chocolate is the main or independent clause. Okay, it's your turn. Identify the 2 clauses in this sentence. Because he studies, he gets good grades. Tell me which one is the dependent and which one is the independent clause. Right. Because he studies is the dependent clause, and he gets good grades is the independent clause. Here's a little bonus. Can you tell me what the subjects and verbs of the sentence were? He is the subject and studies and gets are the verb. It's important to note that when I say phrases and clauses, there is a difference between the 2. A phrase is a group of words that act as a single part of speech, such as a noun, verb, adjective, or adverb. A phrase never includes the subject of the sentence acting through a verb, while a clause does. Here are some examples. In the nick of time is a phrase because it doesn't include a verb. Before the summer ended is a clause because the summer is doing something. It is ending. Here's some practice. Which is the phrase and which is the clause out of these two sentences? Because the wolf hid out in the forest, and tripping merrily along. Think about it and tell me which is the phrase and which is the clause. Did you figure it out? It's because the wolf is hid out in the forest is the clause because it has the subject, the wolf, and it's doing something, hiding. The other one, tripping merrily along, is the phrase because it has no subject. There are three different kinds of dependent clauses: adverbial, adjectival, and mnemonial. An adverbial dependent clause describes the verb in the main clause. It answers either where, when, why, how, and to what degree. An adverbial clause begins with a subordinate conjunction. This is in our parts of speech video if you don't know what that means. This makes the clause subordinate or dependent. Some examples include, that is the cafe where we held the meeting. This answers where. Another one is, when Ava comes, Mark leaves. This answers when. The adverbial dependent clause, if you don't know, is when Ava comes. And in the last sentence, it was where we held the meeting. Another example that answers why is, she loves cake because it is sweet. The adverbial dependent clause is because it is sweet. Another one that answers how is, he answered the question as if he had said it many times. This answers, how did he answer the question? Now, this answers how in a different way. If you save your money, you can go to college. In this sentence, if you save your money was the adverbial dependent clause. It answers, how can you go to college? Finally, this answers to what degree. You are younger than your cousin. It answers, to what degree are you young? Notice, if an adverbial clause is placed before the main clause, a comma comes after it. However, if it comes after the main clause, there is no comma before the adverbial dependent clause. Next, we have an adjectival clause, which describes the noun of a sentence and answers one of these questions: which one or what kind. It usually begins right after the noun it describes and starts with a relative pronoun, such as that, which, who, whom, and whose. We will discuss relative pronouns in more depth in our pronoun video. Note, who, whom, and whose is used for people, while that and which are used for things. Again, we will discuss this in more depth in our video about pronouns. Examples of this dependent clause include, Joe read the book that I gave him. The dependent clause is that I gave him, and it answers which one. It is the one that I gave him. A politician who is trustworthy has the support of the people. This answers what kind, a trustworthy politician. And the dependent clause is who is trustworthy. Additionally, an adjectival clause can be used with the selected subordinating conjunctions when to describe a time, why to describe a reason, and where to describe a place. Examples include, spring is the season when everything blooms. It is the season is being described. I understand why I couldn't climb the tree. Describes a reason. The house where I was born has been turned into apartments. This describes the house. Notice, commas are used with adjectival clauses based on how essential the clause is. An essential clause is needed to clarify the noun. Typically, an adjectival clauses that are essential don't begin with the word which and are not separated from the sentence with commas. For instance, in the sentence above, a politician who is trustworthy, the dependent clause was necessary. It clarified the noun. A regular politician who is not trustworthy could not have the support of his people. This is why only a trustworthy politician has the support of his people, and the dependent clause was necessary, so no commas were separated it from the sentence. An example of a non-essential adverbial clause is Central Park, which is located in New York City, is a beautiful sight. The adverbial clause, which is located in New York City, is unnecessary because it's not necessary to say Central Park is beautiful. It's an addition that adds detail to the noun, but it does not clarify the noun. Can you tell me what sentence is essential here and why? George fell in love with someone who lives in Alaska. George fell in love with Marilyn, who lives in Alaska. Think about it. Which one of these sentences has an essential dependent clause that would not be separated with a comma? The first sentence has an essential clause because it clarifies the noun, while the second sentence gives you an extra piece of information that does not clarify the noun. Finally, we have pneumonia clauses. They name a person, place, thing, or idea, like a noun. Pneumonia clauses typically begin with interrogatives: who, whom, what, which, whoever, whomever, whatever, when, where, how, and why. We will talk about that in our video about pronouns. Now, this clause can be a subject, subjective, complement, a positive, objective preposition, direct object, indirect object, and retained object. But you don't need to worry about that too much. Just listen to these 3 examples and try to get an idea about what a pneumonia clause is. Why you did that is a mystery to me. The clause is why you did that. This clause is the subject of the sentence. Jerry gave what Joe suggested a try. The clause is what Joe suggested, and it is an indirect object of the sentence. And we also have pneumonia clauses that can begin with expletives: that, whether, and if. The fact that you are here is reassuring to me. The clause is that you are here. Now, we also have the question is whether he can do the job. The pneumonia clause is whether he can do the job. Finally, we have I don't know if it's raining, and the clause is if it's raining. Here's some additional vocabulary. We will also be discussing these further in the video, so pay attention. An object is a noun that receives the action. You can figure out the object of a sentence by asking the subject did what, to whom, or for whom. A prepositional phrase modifies a word in a sentence and begins with a preposition, such as in, at, for, behind, until, after, of, and during. A preposition is a word or phrase that connects a noun or pronoun in a sentence to a verb or adjective in the sentence. It typically shows direction, location, time, or introduces an object, which we just discussed. For example, in the sentence, Jane hid under a pile of books. In this sentence, Jane is the subject, the verb is hid, the letter is the object of the sentence, and under a pile of books is the prepositional phrase. It's important to remember when adding modifiers like prepositional phrases to a sentence, there is a change for it to be it can be a dangling modifier or a misplaced modifier, and these would be common mistakes made in grammar. For example, a dangling modifier is a phrase or clause that modifies something that isn't even in the sentence. A misplaced modifier is a phrase or a clause in the wrong place, which makes it confusing for the reader to understand what it is modifying. Examples include Greta smelled the meatloaf coming into the house for dinner. The modifier coming into the house for dinner is a misplaced modifier, because when placed at the end of the sentence, it wrongly modifies the noun meatloaf when it really is supposed to modify the noun Greta, or pronoun Greta, noun Greta. A pronoun would be she. This makes the sentence incredibly confusing because when someone reads the sentence, they'll picture meatloaf walking into the house instead of Greta walking into the house. In order to fix the sentence, you must make sure you place the modifier in the correct place close to what it is modifying. For example, you could change the sentence to, coming into the house for dinner, Greta smelled the meatloaf. This modifier is now close to the noun it is actually modifying, Greta, instead of the noun it accidentally modified, meatloaf. Another example of a dangling modifier is, excited about the first game of the season, Javi's hockey skates sat in the front hall ready to be worn. The modifier excited about the first game of the season is a dangling modifier because it modifies the noun hockey skates. But hockey skates can't be excited because they're not a living thing, they're an object. What the modifier is actually trying to modify is the noun Javi, but this isn't in the sentence. You could change the sentence to, you have an idea? Excited about the first game of the season, Javi kept his hockey skates in the front hall ready to be worn. In this sentence, we have included the thing Javi, the phrase is modifying. Javi excited, not the hockey skates. Here's some practice. What is wrong with this modifier and how do you fix it? Before they melted, the kids decorated the snowman. This is a misplaced modifier. And to fix it, you would make the sentence, the kids decorated the snowman before they melted. Now let's get into the real point of this video. We will now be talking about the 4 types of sentences. There are simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, and compound complex sentences. In a simple sentence, it contains a subject and a verb. It can also have an object and a modifier, but it can only have one independent clause. Examples include I studied or I studied math for an hour. I is the subject, studied is the verb, math is the object, and for an hour is the modifier, but there is only one independent clause in this sentence. Next, we have compound sentences. These sentences must contain 2 independent clauses. These 2 independent clauses are combined with a common and coordinating conjunction or a semicolon, which again is a dot and a colon and a comma. Examples include, she played 5 instruments, but she couldn't learn how to play the cello. And I rode a bike, then walked around the park. Thirdly, we have complex sentences, which have an independent clause and a dependent clause. The dependent clause can mention the subject, who or what, the time, since, or while, or expand the independent clause, because or if. And those words that I just mentioned, who or what, since or while, because or if, will show you what what the dependent clause is doing. For example, she was a girl who loved art. This mentions the subject. If you go to the supermarket, can you pick up eggs? The dependent clause is if you go to the supermarket. And the main clause is can you pick up eggs? Another sentence is when it is one, pick up Mark. Remember, if the sentence begins with a dependent clause, a comma should come before the 2 clauses. A compound complex sentence has at least 2 independent clauses and 1 or more dependent clause. Examples include, while my mother made the salad, I cooked the meat and roasted the carrots, and is the coordinating conjunction in this sentence. Another sentence is, when I left the house, I went biking till 8 o'clock at night, but then my mother called me in. Commas play an important part to help the reader understand the sentence. so it's really important that you understand where you should put the comma. Here's a little test of your knowledge. Identify the independent clauses in this sentence. Although she enjoys reading, she prefers writing. Which one is the clause, and which one is the independent clause, more specifically? Is it, although she enjoys reading, or is it, she prefers writing? Do you have it? Pause the video if you don't, but it is, she prefers writing, because it has the subject, she, and the verb prefers. Identify the dependent clause in this sentence. He has been teaching since he was 24 years old. Is it, he has been teaching, or is it, since he was 24 years old? Think about it. It is, since he was 24 years old. And the minimum requirements for a sentence in English includes the following. Choose more than one. Does it include an object, punctuation, a verb, a prepositional phrase, or a subject? What out of these things mentioned is necessary, is required for it to be a proper sentence and have proper sentence structure? If you said punctuation, a verb, and a subject, then you are correct. A prepositional phrase and an object, yet again, is not necessary, but it can add to the sentence. Here's another question. True or false? An English sentence follows this structure: subject, verb, object. True or false? This is true. It follows the subject plus verb plus object word order. Complete the sentence. A simple sentence, A, contains at least two independent clauses, B, contains at least one independent clause and one dependent clause, or C, contains only one independent clause. Which one is it? If you said C, contains only one independent clause, then you are correct. It's simple, so it doesn't need that much. It only needs one independent clause. Here's another question. The results of my study were inconclusive. This is an example of a what sentence? Compound, simple, or complex? If you said simple, then you are correct. Yet again, this only includes one independent clause and nothing else. Here's another sentence. Even though I discovered some answers to the questions, the results of my study were inconclusive. Is this an example of a simple, compound, or complex sentence? If you said complex, then you will be correct. It has the dependent clause, even though I discovered some answers to the question, and the independent clause, the results of my study were inconclusive, which is necessary for it to be a complex sentence. It must have a dependent and independent clause. Now, we have the results of my study were inconclusive. Therefore, I will need to conduct more research on the topic. This is an example of a complex, compound, or simple sentence. If you said compound, then you would be correct. The results of my study were inconclusive is yet again an independent clause, and the sentence, therefore I will need to conduct more research on the topic, is also an independent clause. Which of these complex sentences is punctuated correctly? Sentence variety improves readability, comma, because the variation makes the sentence more interesting, period. And that sentence started with a capital letter. Capital, S. Sentence variety improves readability because the variation makes the sentence more interesting. Period. Think about this, and if you need to, replay what I just said so that you could go over it. You may have to pause the video. I understand this one's a little bit more complicated. But the answer is B. Sentence variety improves readability because the variation makes the sentence more interesting, period. There is no comma in between the words readability and because. Remember, a dependent clause that comes after the main clause doesn't always need a comma, and in this case, it doesn't. If it comes before, it would. Finally, we have a true or false. A compound, complex sentence contains at least 2 independent clauses and at least 2 dependent clauses. Is this true or false? This one is false. It only needs to contain 1 dependent clause, not